for being a little but welcome to our Halloween bash. Today we are featuring a master class with the returning scholar of the wonderful Dr. Irina Maria Manea, titled Don't Fear the Draugr, the Role of the Icelandic Undead. First, just a little bit of business to get us going. A little bit about what SASA is. We're the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. We work to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work toward our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. You can find us on all of your major social media platforms. You simply search the Save Ancient Studies Alliance to find us. Our live event protocol, we do just ask that you please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. Feel free to pop them in the chat. And if we have time, we'll certainly read them off and try our best to answer them. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Our live events are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. They're also all recorded and archived. Please do consider becoming a SASA supporter. You can join the community of SASA supporters through a monthly donation as little as $3. Subscribe on Twitch for $5 a month. Really, any amount helps. This is part of what our Halloween bash is for. You get perks, see our SASA supporter brochure on our website if you're interested in that. And we also send out quarterly updates on the progress made with your support so that you know where every dollar is going. For more information, you go to saveancientstudies.org/Halloween bash to learn more. And you can also scan that little QR code on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and it takes you directly there as well. And lastly, thank you for joining us. I'm going to be in the background now and hand everything over to Irina.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again. I am thrilled to be presenting to you today something I prepared on the occasion of Halloween, and it has to do with the undead in the Old Norse world. And the term Draugr in particular, we're going to be exploring the term and its problems, and in particular, two categories of these Norse undead or zombies or vampires, although I don't think the modern terminology can apply in this case, but let's see what we can find out. Many thanks to the Save Ancient Studies Alliance for this invitation, and I hope you will enjoy this presentation. I will start by telling you a little bit about the term itself, because if you look in the Old Norse dictionaries, you're going to find two interesting things, two meanings. So basically, it is a term that occurs in poetry quite a lot, and in poetry, it is used as a metaphor or the so-called kenning in Old Norse for man or warrior. So it doesn't really have this connotation of undead or zombie or anything of the sort. So this is the first meaning. And the second meaning is that of, let's say, spirit or undead, or especially a dead inhabitant of a burial mound or of a cairn. And this actually makes a lot of sense, and I will explain to you why a little later. So I am going to start with a few general remarks, and then I'm going to discuss two particular types of undead. The mound dwellers, the Haugbui, and the Apterganger, the violent undead, who are a little bit more famous. Mind you, there are also other types, and the classification has its limits. I don't think there is a certain way of putting these creatures into their particular category and saying this is for certain an Apterganger, this is for certain a mound dweller, and so on and so forth, although we can differentiate a little bit between them. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit their social function regarding their interaction with the living, and then point out two other topics related to this one, such as the afterlife and reanimation. All right, so if you go through Old Norse literature, you are going to find some ideas about why some people choosing to stay, hang around after their death. For example, they might have an interest in the affairs of the living, and we have here an example I will be dealing with a little later, the hero Gunnar from the saga of Njol. Then we have the idea of certain people wanting to control the household and, generally speaking, the territory they used to live in, the district. And as an example, we have in Laxdöla saga, the saga of the people of the Salmon Valley, the character known as Hrapr. And in many other sagas, in Hensathori saga, for example, we have Other, and these people generally are Gangar in the sense that they can also act very violently in their tendency to control the territory also after their death. With regard to the mound dwellers, here you're also going to find a very common pattern, which is that of the interruption by interfering of the living. For example, you have some hero or some king hunting for a treasure and breaking into a burial mound. And in this case, you have the dead, the undead, reacting at this interruption, although at the beginning he might not have had any violent intention. These characters are often particularly strong and troublesome personalities during their lifetime, and these characteristics are transferred to their undead personality, and this happens very often with the Apterganger, with the, let's call them, revenants. And we have an example here, Thorolfur Bægifotur from the Erbygja saga. Again, I will be discussing him a little later. He is, well, perhaps one of the most compelling revenants you can find in Old Norse literature. You can also find the idea of retribution, although I don't really think it's a pattern in Old Norse literature. So the dead coming back to haunt the living because they want something from them. We do have examples if we look for them. For example, in Svartdøla saga, we have the hero named Klövi, the character named Klövi, who is killed treacherously, and then he starts haunting the family who brought him his doom. Well, when discussing this topic, I think it's a little it's very important to discuss to also discuss what it meant to be undead and what remained when you became undead. And for this, we need to talk a little bit about the idea of the soul in Old Norse, at least to mention the fact that the soul was not conceived like it is conceived in Judeo-Christian ideology, in the sense that you have a body and you have a soul, and the soul separates from the body after you die. In Old Norse literature, religion, culture, you have several elements, and these elements are alluded at in both the Poetic Edda, the collection of poetry from the 13th century, but withholding beliefs which are thought to be much older than that. And you also have references to the in the Prose Edda written by Snorri, although some things have been corrupted by Christian ideology. But anyway, the point is that you have several elements of life. You have, for example, the Und, which would mean something like breath of life. This is given by Odin, for example. Then you have the idea of other, wit or understanding or sense. It's a very complex word. And then you have the idea of law, which is basically shape. So at least three elements. So the question would be, which ones do the undead keep and which ones do they lose? These Draugr seem to have some kind of human appearance, but not the same appearance they used to have during their lifetime, and this is most probably due to the fact that they lose their shape. They become these hybrid creatures between life and death, in this kind of liminal space in between us, between the land of the living and the land of the dead. They probably also lose their sense of mind and reason because of the fact that although most Draugr also had some kind of troublesome activity going on during their lifetime. They are truly difficult to deal with after they die, and this is also reflected in their increased strength, for example. So all kinds of transformations going on after they die. So, for example, about Hrapr, we find the information that he was as bad as he was during his lifetime, but his misfortune increased greatly after he was dead. And with reference to the reverence, you also find this idea of the undead walking a lot more than they used to do in their lifetime. And I also found a very interesting example from the saga of Egil, Einhenda og Osmundar Berserkjabana, the saga of Egil the One-Handed, and Osmund the Bane of the Berserkers, the killer of berserkers. And here you have the tale of two brothers, and Osmund says that he is going to be buried alongside Aran after he dies, which he does, and then he describes the experience he had in the burial mound, and he describes Aran to be rising from the chair, and then to have eaten a hawk and a dog, which were also in the mound. Okay, let's say this is kind of normal if you think about the fact that the undead or the dead probably also had felt the need to indulge in something or to satisfy their needs after death, at least in accordance to this type of religion. But then he describes something very strange. He describes him skinning the horse which was also in the mound, and eating the horse with blood dripping from his jaws. And then he also invited his brother to share the meal with him. And then he says that his brother started attacking him, grabbing his ears and trying to tear them both off. So you can see this gradual transformation from a regular person, normal person, to the undead. All right, and this also has to do with the main conceptions about the fate of the dead. And in Old Norse religion, it's quite interesting and problematic at the same time. So the place of the dead after after they get on the other side, because you often find this idea about the good coming to Valhalla and the rest going somewhere else. Well, that's not really that simplistic, I would say. You generally have this idea of going inside a realm of the gods, although I do suspect that's kind of a later concept. And you do have this idea of them continuing to dwell within the earth itself. And here you also have the connection to the other world, broadly perceived as hell. So my suspicion would be that hell was like the generic term for the afterlife, for the other world. There is actually very little evidence to the fact that it was an underworld. This might also have been some kind of Christian contamination. And besides, we don't really have clear descriptions of this realm being some place underworld. We do have a lot of descriptions regarding the road to hell. We have, for example, Hermod's trip after Baldur's death. But anyway, I suspect that this idea of the burial mound can be as a potential gate between worlds, and we do have references here. For example, we have the poem of Helgi, Helga Kvidda Hundingsbana, I will be referring to later, and we also have the waking of Angantyr from the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. In which Hervor basically wakes up her father, who is in Valhall because he's a famous warrior, he's a famous berserk, but she wakes him up to provide her with a sword, the magic sword Thirfing, which is actually hers by birth as an inheritance. So either way, I think that we have this larger concept of an other world. I think we have this concept of the burial mound being the connection to this other world, and I also think we have this more particular place known as Valhall. But initially, I think this idea of the underworld, of the other world, was rather linked to the idea of being just transported and kept in a burial mound. Because if you look at the etymology of the noun hell itself, it comes from an old root meaning to cover. So to cover your body with earth, to be given back to the earth. And in this way, you can basically belong to both worlds. So you have the burial mound, which keeps you in contact with the land of the living, but you also, you know, mind your own business in the other world. Now, let's discuss the term Draugr a little more. So, as I said at the very beginning, I think that it is rather a collective term. And I think this idea of it being linked to the trunk, so something that remains after death, the body, the physical body with its physical characteristics, is actually a pretty compelling image if you think of the myth about the creation of people in Old Norse mythology, because you have Askr and Embla, and they are created out of drifting wood found on a beach. You can find references to this myth in different forms in both the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, but generally speaking, there are three gods involved, either Odin, Lothar, and Hönir, or Odin and his brothers, the sons of Bur, who endow two trunks, so two pieces of wood. They endow them with different characteristics. So basically, when you become a Draugr, you come back to your initial form, which is that of a piece of wood. If you're going to read some of the Old Norse stories, you're going to find two main categories of such Draugr, of such undead. The first one would be the Haukbui. These are the mound dwellers with mostly activities in their grave. They also interact with the world of the living, but this usually happens when they get robbed, or if there is some kind of interference from the land of the living. The second category, which is a little better known because it's a little more interesting, I also have to confess this, I prefer the stories about the Afturganger, literally the afterwalkers. These are the ones who actually terrorize the communities outside of the grave and have a lot of activities outside of their grave. Besides these two categories, I must add that there are also a lot of other spirits and ghosts which we can't really classify as either mound dwellers or Afturganger. So a lot of them are, for example, kind of ethereal appearances, or people appearing after death, but just like conveying a message, or sharing some important news with the members of the family, or requesting something, but then they just disappear. So their interaction with the living is very limited. Right, and I mentioned before that one of the most famous mound dwellers we can actually find in the Poetic Edda, in this collection of poetry. It has to do with the hero Helgi and his burial mound, and with his wife Sigrun. So after Helgi dies, we have Sigrun, who sends one of her serving women to his mound, and she actually sees Helgi riding towards the mound with a large following of men. And then here she says, is this an illusion that I am seeing before me, or is it that Ragnarok has come? Because I see dead men riding, riðamenn dauðir. I see them riding their horses with spears. And then she wonders if these people, if these dead kings, actually have been given leave to come home from Valhall, because technically speaking, they should be with Odin in his army of Einherjar, just fighting and preparing for the ultimate battle. But they don't do that. They're actually riding outside of this realm. And then Helgi explains that, it's true, you can see us here, and we are driving our horses with the spears, and it is not an illusion, and neither have we been given permission to come home to Valhall. But then the serving woman goes back home, and she says to Sigrun, Helge's wife, if you want to see your husband, um, go back from your home, go back to the burial mound, Uppshaugerlokin Komines Helgi, because Helgi has come back and his wounds are bleeding, and the Lord of men asks you to come to him, to go to him and tend to his injuries. And this is actually kind of a tragic story, because there is this very emotional reunion of Sigrun and Helgi, but Helgi ultimately cannot stay in the land of the living, because he does not belong to this world anymore. So he is forced to go back, and even if they share a moment of intimacy, Sigrun is ultimately left alone. So I think this is quite a compelling image from, like I said, an older source, pointing to the fact that these ideas about the undead and about the Draugr or mound dwellers being somehow suspended between the two worlds is not only a literary motif. I suspect that was actually a recurring idea, or at least it does sound like something Vikings would have believed. Okay, if you look at stories about mound dwellers and burial mounds, you're going to notice the fact that, well, first of all, it's kind of logical. In order to be buried in a grave mound, that would have required a lot of effort, and that would have required a social status. A higher social status from you, so that you can benefit from all those things you carry with you after you die. So, in order to be buried in a grave mound, you should have had burial goods to carry on with you, and occasionally you also would have had a ship. And here, you don't only have literary references, you also have like archaeological references, probably the most famous example being the Oseberg burial ship, but there are a lot more as well. And you also had a lot of things sacrificed and taken with you in the afterlife, animals and even people. And there is the compelling story Ibn Fadlan relates us with regard to what he sees in the land of the Rus, this mix of Nordic and Slavic people during his journeys. But at any rate, it meant that the deceased must have had some kind of social status that allowed his relatives to bury him or her in such a sophisticated way. So the if you look at the location of the graves in cemeteries, you're also going to see that, that the way they're organized status. So if you want that's and um, um, this points out to the difference between the point was that you needed goods, you needed people and animals and all these things to continue to live. And even if you were dead, that did not mean that you had a relationship to the gods limited to Valhall. You could remain in the burial mound and still have a good relationship to the gods. And for example, you have here the case of Thorgrim in Gisla Saga, who is a priest of Freyr, and it is related in the saga that the gods still appreciated the hero, and they maintained good contact, or he enjoyed the favor of the gods. You also find references to this type of other world or afterlife in a story called Thorstein Soter Bearmangs, where you find an instance of a journey connected with a mount. There is a guy here named Thorstein, and he sees a boy talking to his mother, who was actually in a mount. And the boy asked her for her staff, because he wanted himself to go to the other world, or to the underworld. And the staff emerges from the mound, and then the boy begins his journey. And then Thorstein goes and repeats the exact words of the boy, and he also gets the same result. He starts riding after the boy, and after a long journey, he reaches the other world where he actually sees a lot of people celebrating. So you can see that not only Valhall is related to this idea of people living happily ever after as a warrior in the afterlife. There are also many instances where you don't have Valhall; you just have another world, perhaps not specified, but still it is a place of celebration. And mounds, besides that, can also be considered sometimes sources of inspiration for getting knowledge or prophetic dreams. And here you have an interesting story, the Thother Thorleif's Jarlaskald, where you have a character, a shepherd, actually, one of the very rare cases where a member of the lower class sits on a burial mound in the hope that they're going to get something, some kind of prophecy or knowledge. And this shepherd sits on the mound of a very talented and famous poet, and asks him uh, to share with him the gift of poetic inspiration. And after a great deal of insistence, Thorleifur the poet is actually willing to do that, and he comes into action, but only after his patience has come to a limit. So he reacts only after insistence from the part of the living. And this kind of examples makes us wonder if we can actually consider the burial mound as some sort of liminal space, like I said before, a space between worlds where the undead can actually move between the two worlds, either the land of the living or the land of the dead, at will, or determined by a certain amount of factors. And the mound, in the sense, can be seen as some kind of portal. Because if you think about it, the undead, not only in Old Norse mythology, but if you think about, well, basically any mythology, they are border creatures. They don't belong to a certain place. And this can be seen very clearly in the case of the Haugboar, because the moment they start manifesting in the land of the living, they're actually different than the way they are in the burial mound, where they keep on living in one way or another. So when they interact with the living, they are actually in a ghost-like, rather ethereal form, or at least on the outside. And I will go back here to the case of Gunnar Homundarsson, the hero from Brennunjol Saga. This is one of the main heroes, and he is killed in an ambush, and his corpse sat unavenged in his burial mound. But this doesn't make him a vengeful or an unhappy character, because he kind of knows that his son and his other supporters are going to avenge him. So there is one day where some people are passing by his grave mound, and they say that they have seen him, and they have also seen him sing and recite poetry. And then his son himself, Högni, alongside another character, Skarphedin, go to the mound themselves, and they say that han kvad viso så att de måtte höra gölla så att þeir væri fyrr. So basically, Gunnar was there and saying stuff out loud, and you could hear him pretty clearly, although the distance was considerable. Gunnar is a very happy character, like I said before, and he is reciting verses outside his mound, and that doesn't impair the belief that he is somewhere in Valhall as well in any way. And this appearance of his is almost as if it were in a dream, and we also have a term for this dream-like creature, for this ghost-like creature appearing to characters, but it's not really in a dream, because they actually see him. It's just dream-like, fyrirbúð. That's another term you will find in regard to ghosts or spirits on this account. Um, In another story, we have a character called Agnar in Thorsteiniga saga who appears to Thori to prevent his men from robbing his mound, and he tells him very clearly that he should not break into his mound, and he actually offers some gifts in return for this respect. If they pay this respect to him, he offers a pair of magic gloves, a knife, a belt, and some gold and silver. So you can see that these ghosts actually interact with the living, although they appear as visions or as dreams. They do have some physical effects. They can also offer some swords in other stories, but initially they don't really act violently as much as they appear to be offended. Their apparition is a rather ethereal way in the realm of the living, and this can also be due to the fact that it's not really their place. They don't belong there. They belong to their grave, to their grave mount, and this has to do with the idea of hybridization after death. If you're a mount dweller, so you have this more corporeal or scary apparition if you are in the grave, and then you have this more ghost-like apparition if you are outside of the grave. You have the uncertainty of shape. Um, the sources don't describe them, like I said, as particularly horrific when they are in interaction with the living. On the contrary, sometimes they are well dressed, they are imposing, they are even handsome. And perhaps the only scary thing is, yeah, that they make contact to the living, and that's kind of like an unexpected thing. The monstrous features are inside the mount, and they are a result of their suspension between the worlds. Now, breaking into a burial mound and defeating such a revenant, such a Draugr, brought you a great deal of honor and riches. But in order to perform that, because many of these, I think most of these mound dwellers were actually very respectable and honorable people when they were alive, you also had to be of a high status. And some other conditions would also have needed to be fulfilled. For example, you should have acknowledged the fact that you are that it is not your treasure, that you are appropriating the treasure of some other being, and it was also recommendable that you shared that treasure with other people. So the grave goods would not necessarily consider the private property of those who just burst into the burial mound and started wrestling with the Haug buoy. And you find a lot of examples of this in literature. So regarding this aspect of somebody needing a status, a high status in order to fight the Draugr, you have a reference in one of the many references you have in Hromundar saga Greipssonar. You have the hero Hromund, who is advised to stop robbing the people that he meets, but just go and rob the Draugr. Just go and enter the burial mound of somebody who is a worthy opponent, and he then also needs to distribute what he achieves. In the more famous saga of Grechtir, the hero Grechtir is advised in his encounter with a Draugr named Kor. I will come back to him later. He is advised when he breaks into Kor's mound that it is a risky business what he's doing, and he is warned that he should just leave the treasure there. His son is actually the one telling him this because he didn't really like the idea of having a foreigner kill the Draugr of his father and taking away the grave goods. And the wisest choice would be, in the sense for Grettir, to just go and limit himself to the idea of having gained honor instead of grave goods and treasures, which was actually the best treasure you could get. If you killed a Draugr, you would have become more famous and you would have become more honorable. So if you broke into a grave mound and you wanted to plunder it, you would have seen that initially the Draugr, the Haugbuy, wouldn't have been a very violent character. So at the beginning, at least, he would have acted in a pretty tolerant way. Um, and although these characters would have been represented with the superhuman strength and the need to destroy and so on and so forth, at least at the beginning they were passive. And you have examples in the saga of Romund I mentioned before. You have King Thrain, who also has his grave mound broken into, and despite being quite extensively insulted, he is even called a dog, which was the uh, it was the kind of insult that would have provoked a feud lasting for generations. He doesn't really react to that. He waits, but in the end, he does react after Hromund being very persistent in his insult, and provoking a reaction from Throin. Mm, Right. Um, you're going to find a lot of patterns, which are more like literary conventions. If you look throughout the stories, you're going to find descriptions of the mound dweller of the Haugbui, such as him sitting, being bloated, or black, or blue, or stinky. And you are also going to find him with a lot of fanciful adornments, decoration, clothes, and so on and so forth. A very interesting idea is the fact that the hero breaking into the mound has to fight him without weapons, so only wrestling. This might point out to the idea of being impervious to weapons. And there is this great fight going on where the whole mound is being trashed, and a lot of obstacles, such as the great stench, not only coming from the dead himself, but generally speaking, such a great stench that people would actually fall dead because of it. Or you can find also all kinds of natural phenomena going on, like a storm, and also the motif of the mound closing itself at night, making it very difficult for the hero to intrude. And I'm going to tell you about two very interesting stories, because although we have all these patterns that we find in Old Norse literature, we should take each case separately, because the meanings or the motifs are arranged differently, and sometimes you can also find very clear differences between the more pagan versions of the sagas and the more Christian versions of the sagas. So, for example, you have in Hardar Saga a very compelling mound breaking episode taking place in Gotland during the Yule celebrations. Hroar makes a vow to break into Soti's mound, and because he makes this vow during the Yule celebrations, he has to keep it. That is absolutely compulsory. There is no way of not doing it. And then Hörder makes a vow to go with him and not to leave the expedition. So they have a party of 12 men, and in the way they meet a stranger named Bjorn, who offers his help in case they need it. And this character later proves to be Odin himself. So these people go to the grave mound and dig it until they reach the burial chamber, but then during the night, like I said before, it closes itself. And this happens 2 nights in a row, so Hörder goes back and asks for Odin's help. And in this situation, he gets a sword and is told to put it in the opening in the mound during the night so that it would prevent the mound from closing itself. And this trick actually works, because finally, in the morning, they're able to enter the chamber. And it stinks so much that many of the men actually die from the smell. And in the 5th day, they can actually get into the burial chamber. Hörder descends using a rope, which is being held by his friend Geir. And after exploring the burial chamber, he cannot find traces of any treasure or Haugbui, so he asks Geir to come and bring with him fire. Then they explore the mound further, and they find a door. When they break it, an earthquake takes place, and the lights go out, and then a horrible smell arises, and there is a slight shining there, which allows them to see a boat burial, and they realize that the light was coming from the whole treasure that was in it. So there they find this guy Soti sitting on the prow with a very dreadful, scary look, and he remains seated until he is insulted. He is insulted in a poem, actually, and Herder just states that he's going to take his treasure. And at this point, the Draugr starts reacting. They wrestle, and Herder is actually losing. So he asks Geir to light the candle. And when he does that, Soti loses his strength and he falls on the ground. And they take advantage of this to ransack the place. So Herder takes, for example, Soti's arm ring, and Soti, on the other hand, lays a curse on it. In response, they decide to torture him using light, and Soti doesn't really like that at all, so he sinks in the ground and escapes. They empty the place and take Soti's sword and helmet, and when they want to leave the mount, they realize that their friends left the place. And later it is clear that they did that because they got extremely scared during the earthquakes, so they have to pull themselves out of the grave. And this has a good ending for Herder, who earns great honor and Soti's things, so his helmet, his sword, and his arm ring. So I think this is a very compelling example in order for you to see these patterns, these motifs I mentioned earlier about how the Draugr reacts, what the heroes do according to the situation, and so on and so forth. And there is a very similar story, an extremely similar story, Bordarsnaga Snæfellsnes, where you also have this idea of somebody making a vow during Yule, during Christmas, and then having to go rob a burial mound. And this time we have a guest who is a character refusing to be converted, but he is spending the winter with the baptized king Olaf Tryggvason. And on the evening, the king and his men are in the best of their mood until a stinky but fully armed man enters the hall, and he offers his sword, helmet, arm ring, and neckband to the one who will dare take them from him. And he departs, leaving his stench behind him. And due to this stench, the king's men are almost dead. And then Guest discovers that this man was an ancient king of Helluland. And then Olavur asks him to go and solve this, claim the treasure, and get rid of Ragnar in his burial mound. And the king gives him everything he needs for the expedition. He and his people receive iron shoes, 2 magicians, a priest, a sword, a piece of cloth, and a candle. Now, initially, Guest refuses to take the priest to his expedition, but the priest will turn out to be the most useful character on the quest. The king persuades him to take him, and the men form an expedition of about, I think there were 22 or 23 people. There is also a one-eyed man, Odin, as you might suspect, who wants to join the expedition, and he starts preaching something about the old faith, and the priest gets sick of him and hits him with a crucifix. So in the story, Odin doesn't really play an important part. The voyage continues without him. And although it is clear that there is a tendency from on the side of the author to distance himself from the pagan elements, there is still a great amount of supernatural elements in the story. Both magicians, for example, are swallowed by the earth, and then they confront an aggressive bull that cannot be hurt by weapons. In this case, the priest appears and again hits it with the crucifix, kills the beast, and then they walk on the lava fields. Again, the priest proves himself to be the best in the story because he walks on the lava field without protection. And then they reach Ragnar's Mound and dig a hole in it. The next morning, they realize that the mount has closed during the night. This happens a few days in a row. And then, using his water and the crucifix, the priest actually manages to open the mound, and then they encounter all kinds of spirits and temptations. they continue, nevertheless, the expedition, and Guest goes into the mount again using a rope, which is being held by his men and the priest. He is also armed with the sword that the king gave him. He is able to see a ship burial with 500 men in it. They are about to attack Guest, but when the candlelight reaches them, they become almost paralyzed, and he gets the chance to decapitate them. He then reaches a tunnel, and at the end of this tunnel, he sees Ragnar, very dreadful to see, but again, very well dressed and with a treasure at his feet. They greet each other, and Guest starts taking Ragnar's possessions. But when he wants to take his sword, Ragnar begins to fight, and the candle is now almost completely consumed. In this case, Guest appears to be almost defeated. However, he says that if the new god is going to help him, he is going to get baptized or converted to King Olaf's new faith, which is exactly what happens, because a great light comes about that paralyzes Ragnar and allows Guest to behead him. Then the priest splashes water on the men, who in the meantime get insane, and they recover their minds. And when they are about to leave, there is this huge earthquake and the whole island sinks, and everyone is about to die. But then the priest again takes his crucifix and water and does some tricks, and the sea opens and they can walk to the continent. So I think this is a pretty compelling image in this conversion story, because you can see that there are a lot of elements these stories have in common, but then again there are also a lot of elements which are different, because in the second story the supernatural and the supernatural help is used as a means of basically showing that Christianity was the best religion to be followed if you were to go on such a quest, for example. But then again, I think it's also important to dwell on the elements which are commonplace, because you're also going to find them in other stories. So the idea of getting supernatural help, and the idea of magic objects, the sacred obligation in Yule time, the idea of a quest itself, the importance of light, and so on and so forth. And of course, this image of the Haukbui, of being this character who is initially passive, only to react violently when he gets upset when people try to rob him of a thing or another. So, as a preliminary conclusion to our Mount Dwellers, just remember the fact that they are initially spirits who try to protect their whereabouts, try to protect their goods. They share the ability to communicate. They can also communicate in very elaborate verse, in poetry, and usually you can identify them as higher ranking people who are dealt with by another higher ranking character, a hero. The Apterganger, the Revenants, are different from the Haukboar for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think these Apterganger, the Revenants, I don't think they appear in other sagas other than the sagas of the Icelanders, where you are always going to find them in reference to some kind of haunting. Reimleikur is the term. So they haunt either their former household or some people in the territory, in a district, and so on and so forth. And another difference is that they rather act in darkness during wintertime, and the Mount Dwellers are also active during spring and summer, which is actually the time where when people actually could organize expeditions to their burial mound to steal their stuff, or to sleep on the burial mound, to get some kind of a gift or knowledge or whatever. So in the sense, you can consider the Haugboar as being the one haunted. If you think about it, they are haunted by the living. They are the others, and as we have seen, more often than the case, they were compelled to act defensively, and they also appeared in dreams in order to prevent an intrusion. And when the intrusions took place, they had no alternative but to defend their own dwelling. On the other hand, the Apterganger are pretty active in haunting the living and haunting their houses, and we have some very interesting examples. In Laxdöla Saga, we have the character called Hrapr. He is a man from the Hebrides, so he is a stranger, a foreigner. He is he emigrated to Iceland because he was a violent man and because that got him into some kind of trouble. In Iceland, he establishes on his own himself on his own farm, and when he does that, he starts terrorizing his neighbors until old age confined him to his bed. And then when he feels like he's about to die, he calls his wife and tells her that he wants to be buried below the kitchen's door. And he is buried as instructed, and he um, wants to watch over his house. That's the explanation he's offering, and he begins to cause a lot of trouble after doing that. In his own farm, he is a little more aggressive, but the neighbors also get all kinds of trouble because of him. So in this case, they resort to a local chieftain, a local Gothi, and this chieftain goes to the farm in order to purify it and move Hraper's body. And they actually do that. So that is the first solution offered to this problem of the haunting. The local chieftain moves the body, and then his haunting seems to decrease. This is also a reason for which his son settles on the farm afterwards, but the story tells us that soon afterwards he becomes crazy and dies. And then again, the farm becomes deserted until there is this guy, Olav, settling in the deserted farm because it was at an extremely low price and the land was very good. So that was a good deal, although the farm was haunted. And he received some complaints from his shepherds, actually, because the shepherd says one of the shepherds says that he cannot go on with his work because Hrap stands in the barn doors and wants to hide from me, but I am sitting on the doorstep with him. So he is very scared because of this occurrence. And I think it is also relevant that we find this idea of the door being, again, some kind of liminal space where the revenant can move between worlds, something like that. And the shepherd asks for his master's help. Oliver, at the beginning, he doesn't understand why he refuses to do his job, but then he eventually goes with him to the cowshed that night, and he engages in a combat with this Hrapr character, pointing his spear at him. But then Hrapr breaks it in two and keeps the blade. That's also very interesting. So he wants it for himself. Then Olav intends to wrestle him, but he sinks in the ground. Also, an element you are going to find often in the sagas. So what they do next morning is that they go to where Hrapr was buried and they dig him out, and they find his body not decomposed, but very ugly and heavy, and appears to be a body that appeared to have been stronger and larger than in life. And they also find the spearhead that Hrapr took with him. And their decision is to actually burn him. So what we can find here in the story is this pattern of the malevolent character in lifetime transferring his personality after death, and you can also find this motif of the transformation of the body. Of course, after death, the body does suffer all kinds of transformations, but in this kind of perception of the dead, the body's transformation also points out to a kind of transformation in the personality of the character after death. So not only the shape, but also the little sense that remains after death. The other character I would like to discuss is Thorolfur from Eyrbyggja saga. This is probably the most compelling of them all, the most compelling revenant, because of what he does and because of what happens after he dies, because he dies in rage. That's also an important element that you're going to find. People dying in rage having a higher chance of becoming revenants. So you have this, again, foreigner. I call him foreigner because he's not among the first settlers. So if you're not among the first settlers, you would have been, up to a certain point, considered at least partially a foreigner. So you have this guy Thorolver who dies in the middle of an anger display, and also it's very interesting that he died while discussing some issues about his property and dragging some boundaries between lands. All right, and then he is found dead in the morning in the same position, and the household was absolutely terrified when finding him like that, because they were absolutely sure, or they were suspecting at least with a high amount of certainty, that he would actually become a revenant, and they want to take precautions for that not to happen. And it's very interesting what they do to do that, because when they prepare to bury him, they actually don't want the body to go through the front door, because if Thorolfur goes through the front door, he will remember the way back to the household and he will come to haunt them. So they decide to break the wall and to take the body through the hole in the wall. And then what they also notice is the fact that when they use oxen to drag his body, these oxen get extremely exhausted and they end up dead. The precaution measure doesn't really help, because Thorolf comes back and he starts haunting pretty much everything in his path during autumn time. He does that with the shepherds at first, and for example, one of the shepherds is found with his bones all broken, and what they do is that they actually bury this shepherd next to Thorolf. That's also very interesting, because it dwells on this idea that maybe such characters wanted something in their grave. Maybe they wanted some grave goods for themselves, and in this case, a servant. Why not? And then he proceeds with all the livestock in the valley, which is found dead. He also starts haunting his wife until she goes crazy and also dies. What they attempt to do is to move the body into a tall walled dais. Dais was also some kind of burial mound, but it was not as majestic. It was more like a cairn, so some stones put on a lump of earth. So there wasn't really the same honor in being buried in a dais compared to being buried in a haug, in a burial mound. And again, his body is dragged in a sledge by some oxen who get exhausted, and then they have to replace them. And eventually, the oxen get crazy and die. And then this Thorvald character lies in his new resting place until the death of his son. He does appear later after his son dies. He becomes active again and starts killing people again, cattle farms in the area which get deserted, and people set on an expedition to his grave and dig him out. And they see that he has become black, completely black, and also very heavy and large, and he looks horrible, and they decide to burn his body. The story doesn't end here, because even though his ashes are spread out at sea, his spirit, let's say spirit, is transferred to an ox, to the bull called Glacier, who is also engaged in a killing afterwards. And this is very interesting in order to see the evolution of this revenant and also the measures people take against him and how persistent he was after death. I don't think I know of any revenant who was more persistent than Thorolf in terrorizing people after he becomes a Apterganger. From these stories, we can wonder about why these people become revenants in the first place. Are there some kind of irregularities about their death, some kind of traits that become them prone to becoming an Apterganger? And yeah, is dying in anger a reason for that? And also, what I suspect to be the case is this desire of possessing, of controlling, actually the force driving these people to act like this after they die. So if you read the stories, you're going to find something interesting, which is that these Apterganger were not really among the first settlers in Iceland, or they were people of lower conditions. For example, magicians. A magician was also seen as being somewhere on the border of normal society, like outcast, like an outcast. And this idea of being the other in society, I think it transfers a little bit to the conception of your personality after death and to the way you act after you die, because you are still the other. You are the other during your lifetime, and you are the other during your death life at the same time. You will also see that the burial place of this Apterganger is always or almost always a dis, so a cairn. It's not a haug, so the more elevated burial mound, and they don't really have any grave goods, which might be the reason why they are in search of such things. So they have this kind of dishonorable situation of being buried in this particular way, and they might have also been characters who have suffered some kind of difficulty during their lifetime acquiring some possession, some land or some goods, and so on. And maybe the fact that they don't react when people start digging them out to transfer them to another place, because they didn't really have anything valuable to protect, unlike the mound dwellers who had great treasures to protect, as we have seen. Hrapar, if you think about it, starts haunting in order to prevent people from taking over his property. He kills the ones who try to take over his properties, so he prefers his property to remain abandoned than being taken by others. And he does the same when he appears again several years after, when his farm was taken over by another farmer. And something similar happens to Thorolf when he wants to control the valley he resided in at any cost, and he wants to control it so badly that even the birds at the contact with his grave actually die. Um, there is also a difference in status here that needs to be remembered, because if everyone died in anger, then I think the whole body of literature would be full of revenants. But this doesn't really happen. As a counterexample, we have Skatlagrim from the famous saga of Egil, who actually doesn't turn into a revenant, although he also dies in anger, and people were actually afraid of him turning into a revenant, but that doesn't really play a part in it. So I suspect that in this case, well, especially of Thorolf and Hrapar, I discussed before, I suspect that this is a case of a mix of temperament, personality, and of economic factors. And to remember from this pattern, from this pattern of character, is the fact that they are extremely active outside of their graves, outside of their disyar, but they are actually passive when people confront them while they are in these graves. And there is, of course, a difference in motivation if you look at these stories, but At the same time, you're also going to find this common element of them trying to assert their dominance over a certain household or a valley or a district, and so on and so forth. And speaking of otherness, I mentioned before, I think that's the key of interpreting the Afturganger here. We also have an Afturganger in the saga of Grettis, the famous Glam. I say famous because of the curse he places on Grettir, that will bring him his doom eventually, because he becomes an outlaw and he has to confront a lot of hardships in his life. And I find it interesting that this character is also foreign from many points of view. He is also foreign because he is Swedish, and he is also foreign because he's a godless shepherd. So he's not a believer, as the saga describes him, and he also is of lower status. So Mm, so the Swedish shepherd, when he is killed and his body is found, people tried to take his body to the church, but they noticed that he was so heavy that they couldn't move it that far. So this is also a common element, that the body cannot be moved, or that the oxen become exhausted when attempting to do that. He was buried in Adis as well, and Glam becomes an Afturganger a few days afterwards, and among his first activities were to ride the roof of the house at night. This is also a common motif, riding either the house or even riding people, in the sense of trying to possess them. That's also a pretty common element in these stories. In his place, another shepherd gets the job. Everybody liked him because this time he was a Christian. And when winter came and Glum killed him, they actually had no trouble transporting him and burying him in the churchyard. This is in order to see the contrast between the two characters, or the two types of characters. What he does next is to kill the cowherd, and then he does the same in the neighboring farms, and then he proceeds with killing horses and dogs in the neighboring farms. At some point he stops, but then he starts again. He also has some activity in the summer, but in the autumn is when he actually makes his most dreadful appearance. Then Grettir, the hero, arrives to the farm, and Glom kills his horse. The next night, Glom goes into the house and they start wrestling. Grettir tries to drag him out, which he finally does, and he eventually wins the fight. He cuts Glam's head and puts it between his legs. That's an interesting piece of detail. And then he is burnt and his ashes are cast away, far away. But like I said before being killed, Glam speaks a very long curse that will prove to be fundamental in Grettir's story. This attempt to locate this type of Draugr among the less fortunate elements of society, you can also find reflected in other stories. You have the story of Thormund, for example, in Horvardar saga Isfirðings, where he is described as being some kind of outcast, and then being probably a sorcerer as well. One day he dies and his widow asks for help because he keeps on scaring the farm hands, so they wanted to leave the farm. And then you have Olaf trying to help her, and he attacks him with his axe, but then they begin to wrestle, and eventually Olaf ends up breaking his back, and then he carries his body until he finds a point where the water is deep enough and he sinks him. Getting rid of the body is also a common topic in these stories. So, generally speaking, you have several steps to be taken in order to get rid of a revenant. Reburying, burning, and spreading the ashes into the sea are the most common ones, although you are also going to find a lot of diversity in the stories. For example, I offered here the Flomana saga, where you have actually two cases where the hero Thorgils deals the revenant with the revenant haunting a farm, and then with the mother of his friend herself. And the second case is more interesting because the saga describes that this friend asked Thorgils to go with him to bury his mother because all of the farmhands wanted to leave the place. Because of her haunting, and the woman was prepared a coffin, and Thorgils asked for strong ropes, but then they couldn't deal with the coffin, and the ropes broke, and the woman got out of the coffin. So their decision, and she started actually moving, they could barely deal with her, and eventually they ended up burning her on a pyre, and everyone was happy. And a lot of other examples. In Laxdœla Saga, for example, you have a wizard who is drowned. In Grettir Sagas, we have seen you have Glam who gets decapitated and then burnt. And in Erbygja Saga, you have Thorolf who is still a revenant despite his ashes being cast at sea. And in Laxdœla Saga, you have Hrapr who gets reburied and burnt, and the only resistance is actually from the body itself when it's moved. Now, you may wonder, with all this stuff going on, why didn't people use it as a prevention measure when these potential revenants were allowed? Well, I suspect that would have been quite the dishonorable thing to do. And we actually have reference to that in laws such as the Gulathing law. Um, in in saga literature as well, the bodies of those who are obviously on their way on becoming an Aptargangar are never decapitated before burial. And even if they were sorcerers, they might not have wanted to dishonor the body and set a reaction on the part of the relatives to avenge the action in some way. The problem of cremation is also interesting. We do know that pre-Christian Scandinavian burial practices included both cremation and inhumation. Um, and we also know that cultures that cremate tend to not have revenants in corporeal form. So, in this sense, Scandinavia is a particular case because cremation and burial coexisted a long period of time. In sagas, cremation was reserved exclusively for these Aptargangers, so for these revenants. This appears to be, in this sense, an Icelandic phenomenon. Inhumation graves were actually commonplace, universal in Iceland. They were common in Scandinavia, but in Iceland they were universal. So cremation wasn't really practiced. And this might have to do something with why cremation was seen as the better practice to deal with these creatures. And because it might have led, with the passage of time, to the belief that the dead could be dangerous. The Aptargangar stories are not invulnerable to Christian influence. Some of them retain some native elements, other have been mixed with Catholic ghost folklore, and this you can see in stories such as the one told in Flormana Saga, when you have some people lost in an excursion and stranded in Greenland. Some of them were pagan, and when Christmas arrived, the Christian leader of the expedition commanded the crew to remain quiet and to go to bed and keep their faith. And the pagan men, on the other hand, did a lot of noise and they did not respect any rules. And soon after, they ended up dead and they became revenants. What I didn't mention is why cremation wasn't really used in Iceland, and that was due to the fact that it was very costly. It was costly, especially for an island with almost no wood left in the few hundred years after the settlement, and that's why you couldn't really use it as a preventive device. And these revenants could also be drowned and Well, I think that somehow, speaking of paganism versus Christianity, and that kind of things, I think this idea of reburying, burning, and spreading the ashes into the sea can also be linked to an interesting passage from the Ynglinga saga. This is the saga written by Snorri at the beginning of his cycle on the history of the kings of Norway, where he talks about Odin and Odin's affairs, properties, and so on. And this is actually consistent with the recommendation Odin makes in order to be properly buried. So this might have had something to do with with the fact that if you were a pagan, you needed to be you know reburied and burnt and with your ashes spread like in the pagan way, like in the old way, in order to keep you from this world. I suspect this might also have been the case, because we can see that pagan versus Christian also played a part in the stories about Apterganger. Now, I talked a lot about the difference between Haupui or Haupuar and Apterganger, but I also must mention the fact that sometimes this difference is blurred, because Kor, I mentioned before from Grethe Saga, is both a Mount Dweller and an Apterganger, and this might have to do with his particular case. So he basically haunts the whole territory of the Hora Marseille in order to ensure a bigger property for his son. So even though there are ways of of drawing a difference between these creatures, we also need to remember that if we try to classify them in a true strict of a way, we're kind of missing a lot of the point of these old beliefs that can be retrieved in a certain way from saga literature as well. So some of them, I don't think that they can only be considered motifs in saga literature. I think that if we are careful enough, we can actually at least select the ones who are most likely to have been around in one way or another in the old times as well, so in pre-Christian times. As a conclusion to the Apterganger, remember that they are the ones acting violently and aggressively, and they are the ones engaging in haunting and wanting to assert their dominance and control over a territory or a household, and they rather show a problematic position during a lifetime in society. So they were considered to be the others, and this otherness might have been transferred to the afterlife as well. Another interesting idea I found in some articles written by researchers Kirsi Kaneva is the idea of this revenant in Icelandic sagas actually having a social function, in the sense that when you engage with the undead, this can also be interpreted as a way to renegotiate your problematic social status. And this is due to the fact that a lot of the heroes who engage with these characters also suffer some kind of deprivation, some kind of problematic social status, and the status can be then reinterpreted and renegotiated, so they no longer are outcasts. And I'm just going to give a few examples. We have Kjartan in, again, Erbiga Saga, which is an extraordinary saga. I really recommend if you're into this kind of stuff, magic, sorcerers, supernatural, and so on and so forth. It's full of it. So this hero, Kjartan, deals with a group of restless dead. There are 18 members of the family, and they continually harass those living on a farm called Froða. And the restlessness seems to be connected to a woman from the Hebrides called Thorgunna. Again, you can see this otherness manifested in the story as well. And she dies of disease, and her bedclothes are not burnt, and that might be the cause of it all. And Kjartan finds a way of dealing with this problem, and he has the bedclothes of Thorgunna burnt, and then he also brings a priest, his uncle, helps him with. He holds masses, and there are also confessions and purifications of the place going on with holy water and so on. And what's most interesting is the fact that Kjartan, together with his uncle's son, actually summons the restless to a door court in which it is stated that they don't belong there anymore and they should disappear, which they actually do. So I don't know. I don't really know how to classify um, this revenant. It is an Apterganger, but then the way Kjartan gets rid of them doesn't really correspond to the patterns we have discussed so far. But anyway, Kjartan is more important in this example because Kjartan is also a hero with a problematic status because he has been born out of a relationship that was not accepted by his maternal relatives. He was the fruit of a forbidden love between his mother, who was also the sister of the chieftain Snorri, and some guy named Bjorn who doesn't want to acknowledge him as his son. And in the way he acts when these harassments take place, by asking for the help of his maternal relatives, he becomes accepted by the family, and there is also a symbolic acknowledgement taking place some years after these wonders of Froda, as they are called, when he actually receives a sword from his father as a gift. And in this moment, also with the help of this ghost story, he actually becomes accepted in society. Then we have the case of Olaf in Laxdøla saga. He settles on a farm he received from his father, and the earlier owner of the place, Hrapr, I discussed earlier, starts walking restlessly on the farm after his death, and they have this confrontation on the doorway. And he strikes him with a spear, digs up the corpse, and burns it. Um, Olaf is interesting in the story because he's also the product of an unapproved sexual relationship. In this case, he is the son of a concubine. His mother is Melkorka, who is a concubine, but she's actually the daughter of an Irish king. And as an adult, Olaf actually goes to visit his grandfather in order to rediscover his roots. And this episode with the Revenant Hrapr actually takes place after his trip. And like Kjartan, he's also born out of a relationship that wasn't really approved by society. So we have not only the Revenant being situated in this liminal space in between worlds, we also have the characters who deal with them actually belonging to a liminal space, to a place which is uncertain in society. And the Restless Dead seem to offer both Kjartan and Olaf a possibility to renegotiate the social status in order for them to be accepted in society. This is also the case of Grettir. His story, however, doesn't really end up well. So he enters the mound of this character Glam I mentioned before uh, in the course of a trip he makes to Norway, and there he fights the restless dead. But he does so out of his own free will, not because this dead guy was haunting anyone. However, the uh, um, he manages to defeat him. And what's interesting about Grettir is the fact that he also has a troubled relationship to his father that can also be a reflection, or can be reflected in the way he deals with these undead or hybrids, monsters, whatever you want to call them. So Grettir wants to get ahead of himself. He wants to cope. He wants to get famous because he isn't really acknowledged either. He leaves his home with not much. His father doesn't really provide his son with the necessary equipment, such as weapons. He only gets from him a minor piece of property. Um, Nevertheless, in the case of Grettir, at least, he is originally a member of an important and respected family of landowners. However, without the active support of his father, he does seem to be a product of misfortune as well. And this misfortune is reflected in the curse Glam puts on Grettir. And I have the whole curse here, but I'm just going to um, make a summary out of it. So the ghost, the spirit, says, briefly put, that um, it's no wonder that you wanted to meet me, Grettir, but it was a mistake for you to do that. I know that you are going to become mightier, that you are. That you are now, and but nevertheless, you are going to be to be involved in a lot of ill doings and manslayings, and for most part of those things you will have to pay, in the sense that he would eventually become an outlaw, and by becoming an outlaw, that was actually the worst thing you could have become, because that gave other people the right to kill you and not to suffer a trial afterwards. So this glamour is interesting because he speaks a curse, which is not something that happens frequently. But then the saga describes glamour as being a special kind of Apterganger. So he's also between a Mount Dweller and an Apterganger from this point of view. But Grettir also has a pretty problematic status. So I think that's pretty interesting. Thorgils, I mentioned before, who is also confronted with two revenants, or two types of revenants, is also having all kinds of problems. He is informed that the people are afraid of Bjorn's father. In the first example, has died recently and become restless. And after a battle, he manages to overpower the ghost, and then he has to deal with the mother of his friend, Audun. Interesting to see the fact that Thorgils also is a character of more or less problematic status, is that he receives a sword helping him to defeat a berserk, and this he obtains from Håkon Jarl, who actually is involved in why his father got in trouble the first place, because his father was attempting to claim or protect some lands in Norway, and he didn't really come back. And eventually, Thorgils obtains from Håkon Jarl the lands his family had owned in Norway. So through his contacts with these two revenants, he also gets the chance to renegotiate his status, because he's also fatherless. He loses his father due to the aforementioned reasons. There are a lot of other examples where people have to deal with the undead, with unspecified undead. So not necessarily Aptergang or Haukbui, but all kinds of apparitions and ghosts, either complaining about something or offering a piece of advice, or yeah, just delivering a message. You will find, for example, in Laxdøla saga, you will find Gudrun, who is living on the Helgafell farm after changing dwelling places with the chieftain, and she sees her husband, who had drowned earlier on the same day when she arrives at the church. She also sees other men who also drowned with her husband, but she doesn't really interact with them um, at all. So she is given this chance to neglect these apparitions, and I think here you just have the idea of Christianity being able to offer some kind of protection in front of such apparitions. Another example would be in Eirik saga, where you have another character, Gudrid, also a Christian woman. She marries a man called Thorstein, but then unfortunately during winter a serious disease kills several people on the farm, including Thorstein, and after his death he appears to another woman who has fallen ill, and she's also found dead. So that kind of occurrences. And then in a night, Gudrid's husband rises to a sitting position and wants to see his wife. And he actually does that only to make a prophecy about her keeping her true faith, and remarrying, and being blessed. So there isn't really any negative interaction at all. A mix of blessing and also assertion of authority you will find in Grænlendinga Saga, where there is a similar story also involving this character, but at the same time, her husband appears to her after she starts finding comfort in the arms of another man, and the deceased husband declares his words. He states that he does want to make his death easier for Gudrid. He also prophesizes that she is going to live a good and blessed life. But at the same time, it's interesting to notice the moment when he appeared. So when she was trying to find comfort somewhere else. Right, and coming back to Gunnar, we mentioned at the very beginning, this character doesn't really suggest that he would become restless, although his killing is not settled in court, so that could make us wonder, maybe require to require his vengeance, to settle things straight. Maybe in this sense he could become a revenant, but no, he doesn't. In this, on the contrary, he actually is a generous spirit, and he only wants to support his son Högni, because in a way he knows that he is going to be avenged by his son. So you can interpret it both as a prophecy and as some kind of support for his son. And in the case of the dead poet, we also mentioned at the beginning. Well, here you can also find this idea of an undead character actually providing positive traits, helpful traits. In this case, the gift of poetry. So you can see there is really a great diversity of examples. And again, if you want, you can classify in at least two categories. A lot of the characters in the sagas, in Abdergangar and Haukbuar, but then again, there is this very large category of undead, which can't really be classified, and who are involved in all kinds of apparitions, from a good prophecy to asserting dominance or requesting vengeance, and so on and so forth. So my point with this aspect was the fact that the conflicts of the restless dead become involved in are actually both social and psychological. And I would say that in all the sagas, you have this idea of the conflict being actually in the area of a community, so a broadened conflict comprising a whole community or territory. But these conflicts in later sources, they tend to be more individualized. So they tend to refer to the relationship between a certain character and his problematic family, and that conflict is transferred to the relationship that character has with some kind of undead. So revenants as beings with malevolent intentions, as we have seen in the case of Abdergangar, or as beings with some helpful traits if you go through more of the saga material. I'm going to end this presentation by pointing out that the topic of the undead also has a strong connection to other interesting topics in Old Norse culture and religion, in particular with the aspect of raising the dead. Raising the dead is something that you are going to find in legendary sagas, but there are also some references to it in older sagas as well. So this basically essentially has to do with this idea of an army of undead being raised in order to do battles. And for example, you can find in the legendary saga Hrol's Saga Kraka, the character Skuld, the daughter born to King Helgi of a elf woman who raises a mighty army to fight against her half brother Hrolf, and the men cannot be slain. Although hundreds of them are cut down by Hrolf's men, they are on their feet again, immediately fighting with more strength and vigor than ever. And another tale related to that is a tale you can find in the manuscript Flattery book. In the story Solathother, in this version, a number of other characters are introduced to the tale. The responsibility of the conflict is placed not on Hild, but on a mysterious woman called Gondul, who gives Hedin a magic draught, which forces him to carry off Hild and provoke her father to fight him. And ultimately, this is revealed to be the work of Freya. And this is also interesting because we know from mythology that Freya is a goddess who actually has the right to choose half of the dead warriors. And the story involves this idea of the perpetual battle as well. The clue to such raising of the dead seems to be given in the use of the word Draugr in the speech of the hero Bodvar in Hrolf's Saga Krak I mentioned before. And in his speech, the word Draugr is used for the animated corpse. So the one who comes forth from its grave mound or shows restlessness. And in these stories, again, you will find more the idea of the malignant magic surrounding this kind of creature rather than anything else. Interestingly, you can find a similar story related by Saxo Grammaticus, the story of Handingo's visit to the underworld. I also found an interesting story, that of Thorstein Uxafotr, also in the Flattery book. Here, the hero is persuaded by a dweller to enter a burial mound, and when he does so, he finds everything arranged like a hall, to look like a hall with seats each on each side, and this was occupied by a company of men. 12 of them were dressed in black and were hideous and evil to look upon. The other 12, of which his guide was actually the leader, were clothed in red and were very handsome. And although they seem to be very peaceful, sitting on their benches, there is clear hostility between them. And eventually, the visitor from the outside world is requested to pay something because he is not from that world, and then a battle immediately breaks out between the two companies. So you do have this idea of necromancy, which is very prominent in a battle context, and you do find it linked to the general idea of the afterlife. You do find it related to the general idea of Valhall and to the other world, to hell, and well, the idea of necromancy, on the other hand, in mythology, or at least as far as I've read, doesn't really have to do with raising the dead in order to use them to perform some kind of negative action. It's actually more like a quest for knowledge. So, for example, Odin waking up the dead prophetess, the dead Volva, in order to ask questions about the beginning and the end of the world, and also Odin animating the head of Mimir again in order to gain knowledge. So I think there is a difference here between this idea of animating the dead. In mythology, this idea rather has to do with seeking knowledge. And I'm going to end, for now, my quest of the other world, of the Draugr, by invoking one example that is also one of my favorites. I think I mentioned briefly at the beginning. This is the waking of Angantyr being a very famous berserk from the saga of Hrolfkraki, from the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. If you are interested in the saga, there is a very good contemporary translation from Jackson Crawford, and I will actually be quoting directly from this. So In this saga, you have the hero Hervor waking up her father and requesting what she thinks is her rightful inheritance, which is this magic sword. So I'm not going to read everything. I'm just going to skip to the main ideas. So wake up, Angantyr. Hervor awakes you, the only daughter born to you, and Svova, give me from your grave your sharp-edged blade, the one that dwarves made for Sigurlami. Then let me skip a little bit. All right. Hervard, Hjorvard, Hrani, Angantyr, may you all feel as though your ribs had ants between them as you rot in your grave, unless you give me the sword that Dvalin made. It doesn't befit ghosts to bear a fine weapon. So here you can see both the anger of the character and the idea that they possess something they shouldn't because they belong to a different world. And then Angantyr says, my daughter, why do you call out so? You are only welcoming your only evil doom. You've gone insane. You're out of your wits, thinking wildly when you wake up dead men. And Hervor continues to be very angry. You don't speak true. May God leave you to sit whole in your grave if you don't have Tyrfing with you. You are reluctant to deliver the inheritance to your only child. And then the most interesting moment happens because the grave mound opens and it is described as being this huge, fiery and full of flame place all over the grave. And the text says that Hell's Gate draws up, the grave mounds open, everything is in flame on the island around. It's an evil sight to look out of the grave. Hurry back, young lady. Go back to your ships. So to draw on this circle, I mentioned at the beginning a little bit about the afterlife, that the burial mound wasn't actually opposed to somebody being in Valhall or anywhere else. I think this is also a very compelling example of how flexible and diverse the afterlife was conceived by the Old Norse, and also a case to be made for the burial mound to be seen as this portal, as this space of liminality, in betweenness between the two worlds, the world of the dead and the world of the living. Thank you very much for your patience. And if you're interested in a bibliography for this topic, or if you have questions, you are more than welcome to ask me on my YouTube channel. I recommend you go there because I also have a lot of other topics dealing with Old Norse and Scandinavian culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I apologize to everyone for my camera being off right now. It died on me midstream, and so tech issues abound. But yes, follow Irina for more of her work on YouTube. I put it on the screen there. And just a little bit, I have one more thing to put up here. Our Sasa Bazaar is having a sale. Because this is the Halloween bash, I just want to rep this a little bit. You do get 20% off if you want some Sasa swag. We've got t-shirts, stickers, mugs. You just use code HB for Halloween bash. So that's HB20 to save 20% on your order. And if you scan that QR code, it takes you straight there. All right. And before we wrap up officially, is there anything else you'd like to share, Irina?
No, just to follow me on my YouTube channel. And if anyone has other ideas or maybe interests regarding Old Norse culture and religion, just write to me personally on the channel.
Perfect. All right. Well, I will sign off here. And everyone, thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your weekend.
And happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween indeed.